Sitting in a sterile law office, a grieving granddaughter watched her family's massive fortune handed over to her greedy relatives. Her inheritance, a worthless blank leather journal. But what felt like a cruel final insult became a multi-million-dollar treasure map the second she turned on a simple ultraviolet light. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of Harrison Cole's towering Chicago law office, blurring the city skyline into a wash of slate and gray. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Victoria Hastings sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. Across the polished mahogany conference table sat her aunt Amelia and her cousin Dominic. They were dressed in impeccable aggressive mourning attire, Amelia in a sharp-tailored suit that cost more than Victoria's car, and Dominic nervously adjusting a vintage Rolex that peeked out from his custom cuffs. Reginald Hastings, Victoria's grandfather and the patriarch of the Hastings real estate empire, had passed away 3 weeks prior at the age of 82. His death was ruled a massive stroke, a sudden and devastating end for a man who had seemingly possessed endless vitality. For Victoria, the loss was profoundly personal. Reginald had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was a child. They had been inseparable for decades, sharing a love for history architecture and quiet Sunday mornings reading in his sprawling Lake Forest library. However, over the last 18 months of his life, a thick wall had been erected between them. Amelia had moved into the estate under the guise of caring for his failing health. Almost overnight, Reginald's longtime staff was dismissed. Victoria's phone calls went unanswered, and her visits were consistently intercepted by private security at the front gate. Amelia claimed Reginald was suffering from severe dementia, and that seeing Victoria agitated him. Victoria had fought back, hiring her own lawyers to challenge Amelia's power of attorney, but the legal wheels turned too slowly. Reginald died before Victoria could see him one last time. Harrison Cole cleared his throat, snapping Victoria back to the cold reality of the room. The lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and broke the wax seal on the thick manila envelope. "Let us proceed," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the dry, practiced cadence of a man who dealt in death and money every single day. "This is the final will and testament of Reginald Thomas Hastings, amended and notarized exactly 6 months ago." Victoria felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. 6 months ago, right in the middle of Amelia's isolation campaign, Harrison began to read through the extensive list of assets. The numbers were staggering. Commercial skyscrapers in downtown Chicago, luxury apartment complexes in Manhattan, vast tracts of undeveloped land in Texas, and liquid assets numbering in the hundreds of millions. "To my daughter Amelia Hastings, I leave the controlling 80% share of Hastings Real Estate Holdings, as well as the Lake Forest estate in its entirety." Harrison read his tone unwavering. Amelia didn't even try to hide her satisfied smirk. She dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "To my grandson Dominic Gore, I leave the remaining 20% share of the company, the family trust located in the Cayman Islands, and the properties situated in Aspen and Miami." Dominic leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, theatrical breath of relief. Victoria waited. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't care about the skyscrapers or the offshore trusts. She only hoped her grandfather had left her the small, rustic cabin in Wisconsin, where they used to spend their summers fishing, or perhaps a modest sum to help fund her struggling antique restoration business. She just wanted something to prove that the man who raised her hadn't completely forgotten her in his supposed mental decline. Harrison turned the page, his brow furrowing slightly, before his features smoothed back into professional neutrality. "And finally," Harrison continued, "to my granddaughter Victoria Hastings, I leave my brown, leather-bound journal housed in the center drawer of my study desk. I leave this to her as a reminder that a life unwritten is a life unlived. Silence descended upon the room. The rain pelting the glass suddenly sounded deafening. Harrison reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a worn, scuffed brown leather diary. He slid it across the polished table. It stopped inches from Victoria's trembling hands. "That's it," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "A journal." "I'm afraid so." "Victoria," Harrison said softly, offering a brief, pitying glance. "The remainder of the estate has been fully allocated." Victoria slowly reached out and opened the thick cover. She flipped through the heavy textured parchment pages. Nothing. She turned more pages. Still nothing. The entire journal was completely, utterly blank. Not a single drop of ink marred the yellowed paper. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed in the room. Victoria looked up to see Dominic covering his mouth, highly amused. "Well, Victoria," Amelia said, her voice dripping with venomous sympathy, "it seems Father finally saw you for what you really are, a disappointment who refused to join the family business. I suppose you can use that empty book to sketch your little antique pots. Now, if you'll excuse us, Dominic and I have an empire to run." Humiliated, utterly broken, and fighting back a rising tide of tears, Victoria grabbed the blank diary, shoved her chair back, and walked out of the law office without another word. She had lost her grandfather all over again. Victoria's apartment in the Wicker Park neighborhood was a far cry from the opulent mansions her family inhabited. It was a cramped, messy studio, filled with the smells of turpentine, linseed oil, and old dust. As an independent art conservator, her life was dedicated to preserving the past, meticulously cleaning centuries-old oil paintings, and repairing water-damaged historical documents. For 3 days after the reading of the will, the leather journal sat untouched on her kitchen counter. Every time she looked at it, a fresh wave of grief and anger washed over her. Why would Reginald do this, even if his mind was failing? A blank book was profoundly cruel. It was a taunt. It didn't align with the loving, fiercely protective man she had known for 25 years. On the 4th morning, fueled by a potent mix of espresso and sheer frustration, Victoria picked up the diary. She weighed it in her hands. The leather was genuine, likely 18th century calfskin, and the paper was heavy, acid-free rag cotton. It was a beautiful object, but inherently useless. Determined to find some hidden meaning, she packed it into her canvas tote bag and took the train to the conservation lab she shared with another restorer. Her colleague Simon Davies, a meticulous British expat with a penchant for solving mechanical puzzles, noticed her dark mood the moment she walked through the door. "Rough morning?" Simon asked, adjusting the magnification visor strapped to his head as he worked on a torn Victorian-era map. "Rough week," Victoria muttered, dropping her bag onto her workstation. She pulled out the diary and tossed it onto the table. "My entire inheritance. A blank book." Simon paused, lifting his visor. He walked over and picked up the journal, inspecting the binding with an expert's eye. Lovely craftsmanship. Hand-stitched spine. Italian, I'd wager. Late 19th century. "Are you sure it's completely blank?" "I flipped through every single page." Victoria sighed, rubbing her temples. "There's nothing." "Sometimes," Simon murmured, running his thumb over the spine, "people hide things in the binding. Money wills photographs. Let's do a full diagnostic before you throw it into the fireplace." Victoria nodded, numbly. She watched as Simon placed the open diary flat on the steel examination table in the center of the room. "Let's check the paper composition first," Simon suggested. He reached up and pulled down the heavy articulated arm of the lab's Woods lamp. The specialized ultraviolet light was typically used in the art world to detect modern synthetic varnishes, overpainting, or hidden repairs on antique canvases that were invisible to the naked eye. Simon hit the switch. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging the lab into darkness. A second later, the Woods lamp hummed to life, bathing the examination table in an intense, eerie violet glow. Victoria gasped. She stumbled backward, knocking over a jar of brushes. Under the harsh UV radiation, the blank, yellowed parchment of the diary was suddenly ablaze. Bright, luminescent blue handwriting covered every single inch of the open pages. The ink glowed fiercely against the dark background, completely invisible in normal light, but radiating like a neon sign under the ultraviolet frequencies. "My God," Simon whispered, leaning in closer. "It's a specialized security compound, usually only seen in high-end corporate espionage or government documents. It only reacts to specific UV wavelengths." Victoria pushed past him, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. She stared down at the glowing pages. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was erratic, sharp, and frantic, but it was undeniably Reginald's. With trembling hands, she read the first page aloud. "My dearest Victoria, if you are reading this, it means you used the brain I know you have, and it means I am dead. It also means Amelia thinks she has won. She's wrong." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the steel table to steady herself. "They think my mind is gone." The glowing script continued. "Amelia has been slowly dosing my tea with heavy metals for months to mimic the symptoms of advanced Alzheimer's. She isolated me, brought in her own lawyers, and forced me to sign over the company. But I realized what she was doing too late to stop the physical deterioration. I knew I couldn't save the corporate shell of Hastings real estate, so I emptied it." "He emptied it?" Simon asked, his eyes wide. Victoria frantically turned the page. More glowing text illuminated the dark room. "Over the last year, I used my remaining lucid moments and private couriers to liquidate the true wealth of our family. The company Amelia inherited is a house of cards heavily leveraged and weeks away from bankruptcy. I have hidden over $300 million in bearer bonds, untraceable gold bullion and offshore accounts. The map to everything, the access codes and the routing numbers are in this diary." Tears streamed down Victoria's face, bathed in the purple light. He hadn't abandoned her. He had trusted her to be the sole protector of his true legacy. "But you must be careful, Victoria. Amelia is ruthless. If she discovers the accounts are empty before you secure the assets, she will hunt you down. The first cash contains enough capital to hire the security and legal team you will need to fight her. But you cannot simply walk in. The first location requires a physical key." Victoria squinted at the bottom of the page. "Look to the spine, my brave girl. Tear it open." Simon didn't hesitate. He grabbed a delicate surgical scalpel from the tray beside them. He handed it to Victoria. "It's your inheritance." Victoria positioned the scalpel at the top of the antique leather binding. With one swift, decisive motion, she sliced down the hand-stitched seam. The thick leather parted. Tucked deep inside the hollow of the spine, wrapped in a thin layer of wax paper, was a small, intricately carved brass safe deposit key. Engraved on the head of the key were the letters MSB, Manhattan Secure Depository. Simon identified immediately. It's a private subterranean vault system in New York for ultra-high net worth individuals. Victoria pulled the key from the binding, her palm closing tightly around the cold brass. The grief that had consumed her for weeks evaporated instantly, replaced by a surging, white-hot adrenaline. She wasn't just a disinherited, cast-aside granddaughter anymore. She was a millionaire with a target on her back, and she had a flight to New York to catch. Neon lights from the wet Manhattan asphalt reflected in the smeared window of Victoria's cab as it crawled through the dense financial district traffic. It had been less than 12 hours since Simon had exposed the hidden message in her grandfather's diary. She had packed a single duffel bag, secured the brass key around her neck on a silver chain, and boarded the first red-eye flight out of O'Hare. Manhattan Secure Depository did not have a flashy storefront. It was nestled beneath a brutalist windowless telecom building on Thomas Street, marked only by a discreet, polished bronze plaque. Victoria paid the driver, pulled her trench coat tight against the bitter wind, and approached the heavy steel doors. Inside, the lobby felt more like a high-end art gallery than a bank. Minimalist white marble floors stretched toward a single curved reception desk. A man in an immaculate charcoal suit looked up as she approached. "Good morning, madam. How may I assist you?" he asked, his voice a smooth, practiced murmur. "I need to access a private deposit box," Victoria said, striving to keep her voice steady. She reached into her coat, unclasped the silver chain, and placed the intricate brass key onto the counter. "Box number is engraved." The receptionist's eyes flicked to the letters MSB and the unique serial number stamped below it. His demeanor shifted instantly from polite customer service to deferential urgency. "Right this way, Miss Hastings. Mr. Caldwell, our vault manager, will escort you personally." He knew her name without checking an ID. Reginald had prepared everything meticulously. Moments later, a grey-haired, stern-faced man named Caldwell led Victoria into a heavily armored elevator. They descended for what felt like an eternity, the air growing noticeably cooler and drier. When the doors finally slid open, they stepped into a cavernous, climate-controlled vault, lined floor to ceiling, with brushed steel deposit boxes. Caldwell guided her down a long corridor to an oversized, reinforced door. "Your grandfather instructed us that upon the presentation of this key by you, and only you, absolute privacy was to be granted. I will require your biometric scan to link to his pre-authorized profile, and then you will have the room to yourself." Victoria placed her hand on the glowing glass scanner beside the door. A chime sounded, and heavy internal deadbolts disengaged with a mechanical clunk. Caldwell nodded and retreated down the hallway. Pushing the heavy door open, Victoria stepped into a private examination room. In the center sat a massive steel lockbox. She inserted the brass key and turned. The lid popped open. Victoria let out a shaky breath. The box was packed to the brim. On top sat thick, bound stacks of bearer bonds, each bundle banded with astronomical denominations. Beside them were velvet pouches that clinked heavily when she touched them, solid Krugerrand gold coins. But what drew her immediate attention was a thick manila folder resting on top of a sleek, encrypted laptop. She opened the folder. It contained comprehensive dossiers, bank statements from the Cayman Islands, routing numbers for untraceable shell corporations in Luxembourg, and property deeds in Switzerland. But beneath the financial documents lay something far more damning. It was a toxicology report. Reginald had hired an independent private laboratory. The results showed lethal escalating levels of thallium in his bloodstream, a tasteless, odorless heavy metal that caused severe neurological degradation, mimicking advanced dementia. Attached to the report was a private investigator's log detailing Amelia's clandestine purchases of the chemical from an unregulated overseas supplier. It wasn't just theft, it was murder. Victoria's hands shook as she realized the true danger she was in. Amelia was a sociopath. If she found out the money was gone, she wouldn't hesitate to silence Victoria the same way she had silenced Reginald. Suddenly her cell phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed Simon's name. "Simon!" she answered, her voice tight. "Victoria, you need to get out of there right now," Simon said, his normally calm British accent laced with panic. "Someone just tore our conservation lab apart. They smashed the equipment, went through your files, and they took the Woods lamp. I was grabbing coffee when it happened, but building security caught them on camera. It was your cousin Dominic." Ice flooded Victoria's veins. "Amelia must have tried to move funds to cover a margin call this morning and hit a wall," Simon continued rapidly. "They know the accounts are empty. They know you have the diary. If they tracked you to my lab, they can track your flight." "I'm at the vault in New York," Victoria whispered, packing the folder, the laptop, and a handful of bearer bonds into her duffel bag. "I'm leaving now." "Don't go to the police yet," Simon warned. "Amelia has half the precinct captains in Chicago in her pocket. You need leverage and you need protection. I know exactly who to call." Victoria said, her eyes landing on a business card tucked at the bottom of the lockbox. It bore a single name, John Sullivan, and an encrypted satellite phone number. Reginald had written a note on the back for when the wolves come to the door. Sullivan was a former private military contractor and Reginald's most trusted fixer. Victoria shoved the card into her pocket, zipped her bag, and stepped out of the examination room. As she walked briskly down the main vault corridor, the elevator doors at the far end chimed and began to open. Victoria froze. Through the widening gap, she saw the polished leather shoes of two men. One of them was adjusting a vintage Rolex. Dominic. Victoria didn't wait. She spun around and bolted down a secondary aisle of deposit boxes, her sneakers squeaking softly on the marble. "Hey!" Dominic's voice echoed sharply through the vault. "Stop her!" Victoria scrambled toward a heavy fire exit door at the rear of the subterranean complex, a feature Reginald's meticulous notes in the diary had highlighted in glowing ink. She slammed her shoulder against the push bar, tumbling into a narrow, dimly lit concrete stairwell, just as a bullet shattered the marble wall where she had been standing seconds before. They were actually shooting at her. Adrenaline obliterating her fear, Victoria sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. She burst out into a busy service alley behind the telecom building, gasping for air. Rain was pouring down now in sheets. She blended instantly into a crowd of delivery workers and pedestrians, pulling her collar up and dialing the satellite number on the business card. The wolves were at the door, but Victoria was no longer the helpless prey. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom of Hastings Real Estate Holdings in Chicago was poisonous. The mahogany table, once the site of Reginald's visionary planning, was now a sinking ship's command deck. Amelia paced furiously before the panoramic windows. Her tailored suit looked slightly rumpled, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes. Dominic sat, slumped in a chair, chewing his fingernails nervously. "The creditors are giving us 48 hours, Mother," Dominic said, his voice trembling. "If we don't produce the capital, they're initiating hostile bankruptcy proceedings. It's going to be public. The SEC is already sniffing around." "I am aware of the timeline, Dominic," Amelia snapped, slamming her hands onto the table. "Where is she? You had her trapped in New York and you let her slip away with a bag full of paper. We need those offshore routing numbers." Dominic flinched. "She vanished. It's like she has professional help. My guys can't find a trace of her anywhere." "Then find her friends. Find the restorer, tear the city apart until—" The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding crash. Amelia and Dominic froze. Victoria walked into the room. She was no longer the grieving, intimidated girl who had sat in Harrison Cole's law office. She wore a sharp, minimalist black suit, her posture radiating an icy, unshakable authority. Flanking her were 3 large men in dark tactical suits. Leading them was John Sullivan, a man whose scarred jawline and cold assessing eyes immediately made Dominic shrink back in his chair. Behind the security team, stood a familiar face, Harrison Cole, the estate lawyer, clutching a very different set of manila envelopes. "Victoria," Amelia sneered, recovering her composure and masking her panic with venom. "How dare you interrupt this meeting? Security. Security has been relieved of their duties." Sullivan stated his voice, a low, gravelly rumble. He locked the boardroom doors from the inside and stood in front of them, crossing his arms. "What is the meaning of this?" Amelia demanded, turning her furious gaze to the lawyer. "Harrison, you work for me." "Actually, Amelia," Harrison said, looking highly uncomfortable but resigned, "I work for the executor of the true Hastings estate, which as of this morning's filings is Victoria." Victoria walked slowly to the head of the table, her grandfather's chair. She didn't sit. She placed the heavy brass-bound ledger and the encrypted laptop onto the polished wood. "You tore apart my lab. You sent armed men after me in a bank vault," Victoria said, her voice eerily calm, carrying the precise measured cadence her grandfather used when closing a hostile takeover. "You thought because I spent my life fixing broken things I wouldn't know how to break you." "You have nothing," Amelia spat, though her hands were shaking. "I have power of attorney. I have the legal majority share. You have 80% of a shell company drowning in $2 billion of debt," Victoria corrected, tapping the laptop. "Grandfather emptied the accounts while you were busy poisoning his tea." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Dominic went pale, dropping his hands to his lap. Amelia's eyes widened, the facade finally cracking. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Amelia stammered. Victoria opened the laptop, turning the screen to face her aunt. On it was the high-definition security footage from the kitchen of the Lake Forest estate, recovered by Sullivan's team from an encrypted cloud server Reginald had secretly set up. The video clearly showed Amelia crushing capsules into Reginald's evening tea. Next to the laptop, Victoria tossed down the thick medical dossier containing the heavy metal toxicology reports. "Thallium poisoning, Amelia. It's a cruel, agonizing way to kill someone," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You stole his mind, you stole his dignity, and you tried to steal his legacy. But he outsmarted you. He left me the map to the real fortune written in an ink that required the one tool he knew I used every day." Dominic suddenly leaped from his chair, lunging toward the boardroom doors. "I didn't know about the poison. I swear, Victoria, it was all her idea. I just wanted the money." Sullivan didn't even draw a weapon. He simply stepped into Dominic's path, catching the younger man by the lapels and hurling him effortlessly back into his chair, where he stayed whimpering. "The authorities are waiting in the lobby," Victoria announced, looking directly into Amelia's horrified, defeated eyes. "Federal agents for the corporate embezzlement, and Chicago homicide detectives for the murder of Reginald Hastings." Amelia collapsed into the nearest chair, staring blankly at the video loop of her own crime playing on the laptop screen. The empire she had murdered for was dust, and the niece she had discarded was holding the urn. Victoria picked up the empty, scuffed leather diary from the table. It was just a book now, its secret purpose fulfilled. She turned her back on her ruined relatives and walked toward the door. Sullivan stepped aside, unlocking the heavy wooden panels and pushing them open to reveal the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers illuminating the glass lobby below. "Ms. Hastings," Harrison Cole called out weakly as she crossed the threshold. What do you want me to do with the company filings?" Victoria paused, looking back at the boardroom one last time. "File for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Liquidate the physical assets to pay off the immediate creditors." Victoria instructed, her tone resolute. "Once the rot is cleared out, I'm going to rebuild it. The right way." She stepped into the elevator, clutching the diary to her chest. Her grandfather was gone, but for the first time since his death, Victoria didn't feel alone. She had a legacy to protect and a completely blank slate to write her own future. Did Victoria's brilliant revenge have you on the edge of your seat? The twists in this hidden treasure drama prove that underestimating the quiet ones is always a fatal mistake if you loved this story of justice, inheritance, and satisfying karma. Hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this thrilling tale with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more intense, high-stakes audio dramas every single week. What would you do with a blank diary? Comment below.